All right. Hey, everyone. This is Brianna, lead school psych, and back again for another crisis response suicide assessment training. I know many of you have participated in this before, or if you haven't, then this will be an overview, a brief overview for returners. Similar information, just a refresher. I intend for this to be pretty brief and just giving the basics of how we respond to times when students may indicate that they're thinking of hurting or killing themselves here at Rocketship, as well as sharing more resources and people you can reach out to should follow-up be needed. So first things first, we have a variety of resources, including this PowerPoint, this training video, blank document templates, filled out templates to be used as a reference, all within either Google Drive, Box, under business operations, then health and safety, or reaching out directly to your school psychologist. So if you have any issue finding any of these, please orient yourself to where they are or reach out to your school psych, and we'll make sure that you're shared on the doc and the resources. So to lay the foundation a little bit of why we are spending time on this, even though we're working in elementary schools where we often think or hope that this doesn't come up as much, we do have plenty of cases that do show us that our students, even at their young age, are thinking about, and in some cases really taking action towards hurting or killing themselves, unfortunately. So at the bare minimum, we know of at the very least 20 different students who did require a suicide assessment last year. And I will acknowledge that we haven't been great at really tracking and collecting this data across all of our schools. It's something we'd like to focus on more, but we can definitely attest to 20 documented cases of students. And keep in mind, this is 20 students, not 20 different suicide assessments. For some of these kids, they're bringing up these thoughts or needing to be assessed multiple times. So the actual number of suicide assessments is much higher. And we have at the very least 3 cases that we know of where our own Rocketship students here in the Bay Area, this is not including our other regions, were actually hospitalized locally because they were determined by the crisis teams, by medical professionals to be at high risk and not safe enough to return to their homes, needing to be hospitalized for constant supervision and medication locally here. So it is something that, despite us working in elementary schools, is happening. It's happening with our population, and it's happening within our own schools and our own students. Hence the need for us all to know what the legal requirements are, as well as kind of the ethical and moral requirements are for responding, and having a clear process of what to do, how to document, and how to make appropriate calls in terms of deciding that a student is saying something and it's not really serious, or we may need to call in additional experts and professionals to take better care of the student. So first things first, just thinking about what is our role as school staff and educators. We are not, in general, most of us, mental health professionals. We do have mental health professionals on site, including our Foothill clinicians, our Seneca clinicians, and our school psychologists, but those people aren't on site every day. So between school leaders and teachers, the role is not necessarily to determine exactly what needs to happen for a kid or provide mental health intervention. It's to assess the situation, determine risk level, and then supervise and maintain safety when necessary. So really going through this, first of all, if a student does say or do anything that could be taken as a risk factor, and we'll talk about that in a minute, we need to respond by the end of the day every single time. And by respond, that means we're doing a screening and we're providing supervision when necessary and taking additional next steps. But we need to do it before they go home that day for a couple of reasons. It's certainly really important to us that kids don't ever go home and potentially tell their parent, like, yeah, I said this thing at school today, but no one talked to me about it. That certainly wouldn't reflect on us the way that we want to in terms of fostering confidence and comfort with our families. And then also, if by any chance a student were to go home and because the parent didn't know that they were experiencing certain thoughts or having a difficult day, we wouldn't want the student to do anything that could harm themselves because the parent wasn't aware or because we didn't assess quickly enough. So we are responding within the same day before the child goes home every time, no matter how innocent we may think the situation is. We need to at least check in and make sure. We do that by screening the student to determine their risk level, which is the paperwork I'll go over in a minute. If there is any chance the child may not be safe, we're going to maintain supervision until we figure out next steps, whether that's parents coming, whether that's the crisis team coming. We won't let that child out of our sight if they are having any thoughts or desires to harm themselves. If the child is at high risk, or if we're just unsure and we really need more a second opinion or another professional to come in and do a more in-depth assessment, we will call crisis responders. We inform the parents every time, even if it's just a quick phone call to say, hey, your child, made a passing statement about like, oh, I just don't even want to wake up in the morning. But we talked to them and realized that they weren't serious about it. We at least need to provide that information to parents. And then, of course, if there's anything more serious, letting them know what happened and then sharing any resources that may be needed. In cases of higher risk, we are also going to want to follow up within our own school team with an SST or an IEP meeting to make sure that all of the adults who work with that child kind of have an understanding of what's going on for that student and what we can do to better serve and protect and keep them safe when they are at school, and then documenting everything that happened. Getting into this issue of threat assessment and suicide assessment, documentation is super important just because there can be other outside agencies getting involved with the family, other assessments going on, and if we don't have documentation of when things happened and what was said and how they were handled, it just can kind of make that collaborative relationship with other agencies and professionals involved more difficult. So we do want to have that documentation. So speaking of documentation, here is an overview of the paperwork. As you can see, this hasn't really changed since sort of spring of last year, spring of the 2016-2017 school year. We have basic student information, brief statement of what the child did or said that initiated this assessment, any suspected situation that may have triggered the incident just for our own documentation and knowledge, any background history the student may have, asking pretty directly to the child if they are thinking about or wanting to hurt themselves or kill themselves. There's some alternative phrasing here depending on the age level and the relationship with the child, but I do want to emphasize that it is okay to ask these questions pretty directly. It's not going to plant a seed for a child that this is something that maybe they should think about or that they hadn't thought of before. There's actually a lot of research that shows that being direct and asking direct questions is helpful and is needed in this situation and is not known to plant these thoughts or foster more of these ideas in students. We want, if they say no here, that they're not wanting to or thinking about hurting themselves or killing themselves, that's the end of it. They're low risk. We have our documentation that we talked to them and determined they were low risk, and that's the end of it. And hopefully that is what happens. However, if a student does say, yes, they are kind of thinking about this or wondering, wanting to maybe hurt themselves, we're going to go into a little bit more depth to learn about if they have thought of a plan for how they would do it, if that plan is actually possible or realistic. And then, of course, if it's a plan that would involve anything that they could get a hold of at school, being thoughtful about really restricting their access to that, any immediate steps that need to be taken, finding out a little bit more of if this has been an ongoing issue for the student or if it was just a brand new thought for them, if there's any previous history of these thoughts, feelings, or attempts, and then trying to get a sense of, the urgency here, if they're actually thinking that they're going to take action on this today, if it's something that they're just starting to think about. I can give one example from one of our schools. A student said, I don't quite have a plan yet. I'm not planning on doing anything, but I've been feeling this way and I've started Googling different ways I could kill myself. So that, told us this is definitely a more moderate to high risk situation. The student doesn't actively have a plan or any sort of, indication that they're going to do something right away, but they are starting to research and starting to plan. And so that does bring them up to this moderate to high risk. So that's sort of an example of what, our students have said and what they might say. High risk is a student who definitely has a desire, has a plan, knows what they're going to do, or says that they're planning on taking action soon. That's going to be an immediate call to our crisis team, or potentially, depending on the situation, 911 if it's like a really urgent safety concern and we're just not sure we can keep the student safe, and then calling parents. If it's more of that student that I just said, where they're thinking about it, pondering it, sort of researching, but they're not quite at the point of taking action yet, that's considered more moderate risk. We're still going to want to call probably the crisis team, definitely connect with the parents, put a plan in place to intervene really quickly. And then there's our students who are low risk, who said, I didn't really mean it, I was just upset in the moment. That's more just notifying the parents, documenting on the paperwork, but not taking it any further steps. There's a flow chart here of the number that we call for Uplift Crisis. They'll come out to the school and they'll do a more in-depth assessment of a student, as well as sort of the different outcomes that may come from that. And you can see this on the paperwork that's in the Google folder, so I won't go through it in depth. But I will talk through sort of what that process does look like. Here's some more information about Uplift Mobile Crisis, as well as their phone number. This is taken from their website, so you can certainly get more information there. And the key considerations that we keep in mind when we're talking to students about any suicidality. Thinking about what student actions may prompt a suicide or a threat assessment, it can really run the gamut from innocent sounding verbal statements to more severe safety related gestures. Statements that we do hear or that could indicate the need for this are listed here. I just don't want to be here anymore. I wish I would never wake up. No one would care if I wasn't around. These are not necessarily a student explicitly saying, I want to kill myself, I'm going to hurt myself, but they are still indicators that we should do more investigation and we should treat this as a call for help, a call for further assessment. So that's verbal statements we may hear. We might read or see similar things in written assignments or creative projects. And then, of course, much more explicitly would be gestures. And then these are, examples taken from our own Rocketship students. So then these are also things that even without a student saying they're thinking of hurting or killing themselves, if we are seeing these types of behaviors, we're going to, of course, want to check into it more and go through that threat assessment process. Keeping in mind with gestures, we're not going to be having this assessment conversation while they're actively engaging in these gestures or trying to hurt themselves. Step one, of course, and I know that this doesn't even need to be said, but is focusing on safety, de-escalation, and then only after a student has calmed down and is able to engage in a conversation, asking those questions. If they're not able to get to a place of calming down, or if what they're doing is so severe and urgent around their safety, you would just call 911 or the crisis responders immediately at that point. So what to expect when we call Uplift Crisis? The number was shown previously. We call the line, give your name, your school, tell them that you have, a child who's in crisis. We have reason to believe that they might be a threat for self-harm or suicide. They will tell you that they'll take your information and then they'll tell you that someone from their mobile team will call you back. So that's okay when they hang up on you and say, we'll call you right back. Don't panic. That's part of the process. Keep the child supervised and just wait at your cell phone. The responder should call back within about 10 minutes to gather more information and decide whether or not they need to come out to the school. So some options here. The mobile responder may hear what you have to share with them from your suicide assessment that you just did and say, yes, okay, I'm going to come to the school and talk to the child more. They'll want the parents to be there. So at that point, you'll also want to call the parents and try to get them to the school. Then basically the responder will come to the school and they'll kind of take the lead from there, deciding how to manage the situation and what's going to happen for the child. It's also very possible and very likely, actually, that when we talk to the mobile responder and share information, they say that this does not sound like a case where they will come out to the school. At that point, that's their call to make. We just document on our suicide assessment paperwork who we spoke to, what they said, and then let the parents know. In some cases, depending on their capacity and parent availability, the mobile responder may recommend that the parents come pick up the child and bring the child to their clinic. This is something that we should only be recommending parents do if Uplift kind of asks us to facilitate that. They don't really want parents just walking to their clinic because they like to have a heads up if someone's coming in, if it's a legitimate reason for someone to walk into their clinic, and to have a staff member ready to receive that family. So that's something that would just come up on an as needed basis, and you would work with the mobile responder to facilitate that, see if the parents are able to do it, give them the address, and then send them out that way. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts. I'll spend a few minutes on frequently asked questions, and then of course, please follow up with any of your mental health professionals or school psychologists at your site. Common question, do we need to do a suicide assessment every time, even if we've done one for this kid multiple times and we know they're low risk? They're always low risk, or we know them well enough to know that they're just kidding. Yes, we do. Every single time, no exceptions. Yes, yes, yes. It might be a really brief surface level assessment where the student acknowledges, like, I didn't really mean it. I was just upset, like usual. But we still need to double check. We still need to document and just have evidence that we made sure that this wasn't the one time something was different. Do we need to hold a meeting after a suicide assessment? 99% of the time, yes. This typically means that the student, needs to either have a plan built for them that is both proactive and reactive in terms of their emotional needs and safety, or have that plan reviewed, updated, or tweaked. So there may be a few cases where that doesn't need to happen, but I would say 99% of the time, we are going to want to gather the teachers and the school staff together who works with that child, the parents, just make sure that we have all the correct supports in place and that everyone's aligned. What if we think the student's just saying these things to get attention? By doing a suicide assessment with them, aren't we just giving them attention and reinforcing it? Still, not a reason to not assess. We still need to assess each time. We may, in collaboration with a therapist, school psych, school leader, talk about how to go about handling some of these trickier kids and trickier cases, but there is no reason and no excuse to ever not do a threat assessment with a student who's making these comments. So we still always assess each time. And then again, could we be giving our students ideas to hurt themselves by asking these really direct questions and bringing up these topics? There's a lot of research that says that this is not true. Opening up lines of clear communication, being direct, is one of the best things we can do for kids. It gives them an outlet to acknowledge some of these things that can be hard to talk about, and lets them know that we are here and available and prepared to have these conversations with them and to protect them and keep them safe. Some additional considerations. We have found, across our network that there really is a need, and it can sometimes be a gap when all teachers and staff don't necessarily know what to do if a child in their classroom says something of this nature. So we need to have very clear training or reminders for teachers, ECCs, ILSs, anyone who comes in contact with a student about what to do if they hear or see something like this that is concerning to them. And essentially all they have to do is notify a school leader immediately and make sure that student has some sort of assessment done with a trained adult by the end of the day. So just like with CPS, our teachers don't need to be the investigators. In fact, they shouldn't be the investigators, but they do need to call and report when there is suspicion, and it's sort of the same idea when it comes to suicide assessment. I think it's worth noting that several Rocketship students have brought up 13 Reasons Why as something that they have been thinking of or learning from in suicide assessments. So knowing that that is a cultural and media related topic that's affecting our population is important for us to know. If we're hearing kids talking about the show or talking about these themes, that's going to be an indicator that some additional intervention is certainly needed with those groups of students or those grade levels, and is something to keep an ear out for. And then, of course, even if a child's not high risk for suicide, kids aren't going to be making these comments or saying these things if they have healthy and appropriate alternatives for communication, self-regulation, and coping skills. So when kids are saying these things, even if they're not actually planning on acting on them, it's a major red flag to us that they're needing some additional support, whether that's individual counseling, family-based counseling and support, social emotional learning. It's just a flag that we need to be figuring out how to provide additional interventions and supports to these kids. So we don't ever want to minimize the fact that they weren't serious about it as meaning it's a non-issue. It's still an issue. It just means luckily we've caught it early enough that they're not high risk yet. So to summarize, first things first, school leadership teams, I would encourage you all to meet together, potentially loop in your director of schools or your school psychologist to talk about any key staff on your site that need to be trained in conducting the threat assessment directly with the kids. It's recommended that all school leaders know how to do this, as well as potentially ISE specialists in some cases, if that's a need within the ISE population, and if the ISE specialist is comfortable with that. We don't want to overtrain all staff in doing these threat assessments because we don't really want these happening kind of one-off in the classroom without school leaders knowing which kids are surfacing for having these concerns. So we really want it centralized within the school leadership team so that we can keep better tabs on the health of the school, the health of the student population, but making sure that there's always at least one or two people on staff available who can respond should this come up. Definitely, like I mentioned before, training all staff, teachers, ECCs, ILSs, everyone, support staff on the warning signs and their next steps, which is just to immediately notify a school leader. If your school site, your school leaders, school staff need any additional information, sorry for the formatting here, follow up with your school psych and figure out what's needed and how to accomplish that. Our psych team is trained in this process as well and can lead conversations around any of these. Consider developing individualized safety plans for students who have a history of unsafe behavior if they don't already have a safety plan, and I'll show that in just a second. I highly recommend printing the threat assessment paperwork to have easily accessible. When this comes up, it can be a little bit laborious to go searching through your Google Drive and where's that folder and oh, the printer's down and all of these things. So having a couple just printed out that you can grab and write on can be really convenient. Of course, that's a personal preference, but the urgency there can make it nice to have some printed. And then I also would recommend just programming the Uplift crisis number into your phone. Sometimes there might be a crisis need and you're not near your laptop and there isn't someone around who knows the crisis number. So having it in your phone is just an extra safe thing to do, and there it is. So before we log off, just going into our folder for suicide risk assessment and crisis response, you can see that we have the link here to the training video, the blank suicide assessment paperwork, a couple sample safety plans that have been filled out so you can see what that looks like for real students when they're done, a blank safety plan, which I have here. So this is for a student who's demonstrated self-harming behaviors or more high-risk statements. We would want to really lay out a pretty clear plan on what we know about the student, what works, what doesn't work, and what staff will do when these warning signs start showing, as well as the preventative supports, whether that's laid out more of like a behavior plan with those teaching components or other types of proactive steps we can take, such as increasing supervision, removing access to dangerous items, etc., as well as checkpoints to follow up and making sure there's really clear roles and responsibilities for everyone involved. We also have some counseling community resources which may come up that parents are wanting or needing these in these cases. So we have it in English and Spanish. It can be printed and provided to families. Okay, sorry for rushing through that. I know that all of your time is limited and valuable, but thank you for listening to this. And like I said, please, please, please pass this on to your school teams. Make sure you have staff on site trained, and please reach out to your school psychs for additional training, additional one-on-one planning for specific kids, or anything that is needed. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll see these numbers going down and reducing this year. All right, thanks everyone.